What's going on, everybody? This is your man Chuck Creekmur, and I am here with my boy Rob Kenner. What's going on, man?
Hey, what's up, Chuck? Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you. Now, before we get started, I was wondering, could we call you White Rob since in honor of Black Rob, maybe?
I'll take it. I'll take it. Vibes
Yeah.
Cartel called me the White Bob. So,
Okay. Okay.
one way or another, if it helps you remember the face, yeah, that's me.
Definitely. Now you have this amazing book, "The Marathon Don't Stop: The Life and Times of Nipsey Hussle." Gotta love it, man. I love this cover. I love the. I actually have an outfit that matches this book, and
Ooh,
I'm gonna do an Instagram real soon with the book and my outfit.
I can't
Just
wait. That's
yeah,
that's a
definitely.
that's an instant repost right there.
Facts. So tell me and the viewers what made you write this book.
Well, I think because I had the opportunity to meet Nipsey Hussle early in his mixtape run, I had a pretty good understanding that he was going to be an important artist. We met in 2009 while he was rolling out the Bullets Ain't Got No Name series. And over time, I watched him change the game again and again and realized that this was really one of the most important artists and also visionaries in terms of business and activism and self-empowerment. And I was paying attention to his movements and realizing also that over time I thought he was maybe not getting the respect that he deserved. And by the time he rolled out his debut major label album, Victory Lap, I had the chance to have a real in-depth convo when I was at Mass Appeal. And we spoke for over an hour, and when I walked out of the room, I was like, there's no way we can do this justice in a 5-minute YouTube video. It's just not going to happen. And I have a responsibility to really put this story down in a more thorough way. So I started doing my research to do what was either going to be a book or a documentary film. I wasn't sure yet what form it would take, and over time it evolved into The Marathon Don't Stop.
Wow. So all of this started prior to his death. Is that accurate to say? Or
Yeah, oh, for
okay.
sure. March 31st, 2019 was a terrible day
Yeah.
for hip hop, for me, and for, so many people. And, nobody expected that to happen. And, obviously a lot of people who weren't paying attention to Nipsey Hussle prior to that moment kind of got the wake up call, and
Yeah.
a lot of people cite that Staples Center memorial service as the moment that they realized how important he was and asked
Yeah.
themselves, why haven't I heard of this person who's being eulogized by Barack Obama and Stevie Wonder and Snoop Dogg. So the world got the wake up call early, but yeah, I was like yourselves at All Hip Hop. I was an early supporter, and realized that he's one of the most misunderstood and underrated artists in hip hop.
Yeah, definitely. What was your approach to writing the book? I see a lot of work cited, but also definitely that firsthand knowledge shows. What was your approach in proceeding forward?
Well, it's absolutely correct that I tried to do as much original reporting as possible, and you know, the beginning of that was interview with Nipsey, and then over time, I had the opportunity to speak with his brother Black Sam,
Uh-huh.
his sister Samantha, and many of the artists in his inner circle and producers who worked with him from early on. So I was able to get a pretty rounded sense of him as an artist and just a friend and a
Uh-huh.
business partner. And over time, I realized that it was important to also put Nipsey Hussle into a full context of
Uh-huh.
hip hop history, LA history, and American history. And so for
Uh-huh.
that, I went to a variety of sources, books, movies. There's a film called Bastards of the Party that was very
Uh-huh.
important for me in terms of understanding the roots of LA gang culture
Yeah.
and how it relates to the civil rights movement and Black Power movement, and people who saw the film Judas and the Black Messiah, you have an idea of the way the federal government was targeting the Black Panther Party in Chicago. The same thing was happening in LA and the Bay. And so, I thought it was important to weave all of that history into a portrait of Nipsey Hussle, because I think he was up to a lot of big goals. He was always setting big goals for himself, but there were some goals that I don't think people fully understood that he was working towards, and it's important to understand what his movement was all about. Ultimately, it was way more than having hot records or becoming a celebrity. So I wanted to focus on Nipsey Hussle's impact on his community, the Crenshaw district, and all of the people around the world who have tapped into his messages of self-empowerment and independence and just justice. So, yeah.
Based on what you've written, read, heard, where did his sense of community and activism come from, considering the other side of him as well?
Well, I think his father was a big part of that. He described his father as an African freedom fighter. Ermias Asghedom came to the United States from Eritrea when he was a teenager, and he was seeking asylum from a long-raging civil war between Eritrea and Ethiopia, which has been going on for many years and still continues tragically. There are some parallels between the situation in that part of Eastern Africa and the situation in the streets of LA or in Chicago, where you have people who seem culturally to have a whole lot in common, and yet there's a terrible conflict that takes so many lives and disrupts other people's lives and just makes everything harder, and it's really unbearable, actually. So that sense of community activism was definitely instilled in him by his dad, and I think their trip back home to Eritrea, Nipsey described that as a life-changing experience. When I spoke with him, he came back from Eritrea a different person, and I think that was probably intentional by his father. He took both Sam and Ermias back home for 3 months, which was quite a stretch of time to spend. And Nipsey was honest about the fact that at the time he wasn't sure he wanted to go for 3 months. He wanted to go see his granny and connect with that part of the family, and get out of LA and see what life in Africa was like. But 3 months was a long time, and it allowed him, though, to soak up the language, soak up the culture. He talked about how his respect for women increased a great deal after seeing the role of women in African society, and recognizing that maybe American values toward women were slightly skewed and maybe fucked up, is what he said, actually. So he learned a lot, and he was also in a country where all the authority figures looked like him. All the government, all the security forces, everybody, and also where everything stopped for the family meal midday. 2:00, schools and businesses close, and everybody goes home or meets at a restaurant to share a meal together. So just that sense of community is something that I think he definitely picked up in Africa.
Okay. Now, on the other side of things, you mentioned something specific, and this is something that I had never heard or considered, but you mentioned that he joined the Crips as a strategic move. And I found that interesting. Can you kind of explain the circumstances around that strategic move and sort of what you meant by that?
Well, I think there were a lot of different voices in the book who spoke to this question, and it was one of the things that I wanted to fully understand in writing the story, because obviously, as we've been talking about, Nipsey was a brilliant mind. He was someone who could build a computer from parts, reading an article in a magazine. He could come up with strategies that change the music industry, strategies that are used by major labels today. They've completely copied his blueprint on, marketing music bundled with concert tickets and things like that. So, I wanted to understand what it meant for someone with that unlimited potential, to choose to join the Rolling 60s. And, obviously there's many, many factors in that decision. And I spoke to many different people who knew him before and after that experience in his life. And, the idea of it being a strategic decision there's many levels to that. One, I think, is that he just recognized at this point in his life, he was surviving by his wits. He was hustling, and that can mean a lot of different things. I think some people automatically assume when you hear hustling, it's a euphemism for something illegal, but that's not the case. He was surviving by his wits, anything to make a dollar, lots of different creative things that he was doing. But in that neighborhood, there were certain things that you were limited from being able to do if you weren't at least cool with the 60s.
Right.
It was a pervasive presence in the fabric of that neighborhood. So he understood that. And at a certain point, he gave interviews where he talked about the fact that, if you were going to be a part of this neighborhood in some way, and you were going to be making a living by your wits, hustling, there was going to be run-ins with the 60s. So at a certain point, it's like either you're going to be part of this or you're going to get kind of swept away by it. And so that was one level of the strategy. I think there are other aspects to it which, it's important to say, and everyone who talked about this said this to me, in no way are we suggesting that Nipsey was insincere in his commitment or, trying to be, false flagging or anything that is inauthentic. But the reality is, like, to speak for this community, to tell stories of real life in this neighborhood, it was a necessary thing to be considered an authentic voice, to actually be a part of the set. And, people who are not even in the gang will say, we grew up in the 60s. Now, yeah, that refers to the street numbers, but it also refers to how strongly that set is identified with that neighborhood. And that's not to say that everyone in the neighborhood agrees with the gangster life or is happy that they are, present. There's obviously a lot of negatives that come with, criminal activity and, tremendous loss of life and tragedy in the whole story of, gang culture in LA and elsewhere. But there was an element of wanting to speak real stories on behalf of the neighborhood that may have informed his decision. It's also another level to it, which is more based on what I was alluding to earlier when I said that Nip had larger goals that people may not have fully understood. When you heard those early interviews where Nipsey Hussle was talking about Slauson Boys Records, he had a crew called the Slauson Boys, who were, some of his closest friends and also members of the set. He had Slauson Boy tattooed on his back. The Slausons are, Slauson is not just, the name of a street. It's also a reference to a early LA gang called the Slausons. And this gets into what I was saying before. In writing the book, I really wanted to do my research and understand even what my own preconceived misconceptions are about gang life, because like a lot of people, my education of gang life is really from pop culture. You know, I didn't grow up in Slauson and Crenshaw, but I've paid enough attention over time and been a journalist long enough to know what I don't know. So I tried to really immerse myself in the history of what it meant to say you were in a gang. And, you know, a lot of the people from, you know, any set in LA will tell you the biggest gang is the LAPD, you know? And there were gangs that we didn't know about that almost overthrew the government in January, a gang called the Proud Boys. You know, one of whose founders was a founder of Vice Media, you know? So I always just like to ask, who are the real gangsters, right? There's a lot of different definitions of gang, but
he makes that reference too in one of the interviews. Defines gangs as various facets of different organizations. You know, different organizations.
Yes, right. Nipsey talks about like Epic Records is a gang, and the Democratic Party is a gang, and you know, so it's just it's not. And I spoke with people, you know, professors for the book. Dr. Melina Abdullah particularly was very eloquent on this point that, you know, if you've never lived in a neighborhood where there was a, you know, a strong gang culture, you may never fully understand that they can be a very positive force in certain ways. There's a kind of, you know, social support network and sense of pride that comes with that, but unfortunately there's also a mixed blessing where criminal activity and loss of life sometimes go with that. So anyway, the point I was trying to make about the gang history is that, you know, the Slausons were formed because there was another gang very early in LA history. I'm talking like in the 40s and 50s when, you know, the black population was increasing tremendously during the war. There were people coming for jobs, factory jobs, and, you know, to help with the war effort. And this gang was called the Spook Hunters. They were a white gang that was backed by the LAPD, and they had a jacket with a logo on it of a black person being lynched. And the Spook Hunters were known for terrorizing black students on their way to school, you know, intimidating families that dared to move outside of the red line district. You know, the whole concept of South Central, what does it mean when we talk about South Central? That refers to an official government policy called redlining that some people might not know about, you know, and restrictive covenants that are written into the deeds of houses still to this day, you know, that forbid a family from selling their house to anyone who is not white. So, you know, these, you know, the laws and, you know, the contracts are one thing, and then you had groups like the Spook Hunters. So, you know, it was necessary for communities of color to have neighborhood organizations to protect themselves. And, you know, that's why the Black Panthers were called the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. But before the Black Panthers, you had groups like the Slausons, the businessmen, several, you know, neighborhood organizations. I believe that Nipsey Hussle is very aware of this history. I believe that he name-checked the Slausons, not just because Slauson and Crenshaw was his street, but because he had done his research and he put it in some of his early songs too. The way that COINTELPRO had broken up the Black Panthers, and that, you know, the Crips and the Bloods rose from the ashes of the Black Panthers in a sense, you know. And that's in that film I was telling you about, Bastards of the Party. So, you know, like the other key thing that I haven't mentioned, the head of the Slausons was Apprentice Bunchy Carter. He was recruited by the Panthers to open the LA chapter of the Black Panthers. So, you know, he became politicized after being a member of a gang and started a very powerful and very successful branch of the Panthers that was quickly targeted, and of course he was killed, you know, under circumstances that can be called mysterious at best, and you know, it looks like similar to Fred Hampton, similar to Malcolm X, that it may have been a COINTELPRO driven assassination. So I say all that to say part of the strategy that I believe Nipsey may have had in mind was that these organizations could be redirected to their original purposes.
Yeah.
And, that perhaps in the time that he was coming up, he talked about being the Tiny Loke generation. The Tiny Lokes were young gang members who grew up at a time when there were gang injunctions in place. So that meant that the OGs had either been arrested or could not gather. There were actually laws that, people from so-called gang neighborhoods, whether or not they were in the gang, couldn't gather together, couldn't wear white t-shirts, couldn't have a pager, couldn't do all sorts of things that would basically limit the social aspect of gangs. So the mentorship, the apprenticeship, the passage of institutional knowledge from the OGs to the younger heads was lost because of this gang injunction thing. So Nipsey became kind of like a young leader within his set, and was articulating a new way to be a Crip, a new meaning for that purpose, getting away from things that were just going to automatically get you locked up. You can't do certain things now that cell phone towers track your movements. There's hidden cameras everywhere. You've got to get into some different hustles, and he was showing the way of how to do that, and so I think that was part of the strategy. If it's something that I say it very carefully and with a lot of research behind it. I think that he believed. He would always talk about this film, The Spook Who Sat by the Door.
Yeah, classic.
And the book, and that is based on the same concept. It's like taking knowledge and instilling it in the streets and bringing about social change through that. So and that was also going to be the title of one of his albums that he didn't get a chance to
get out. The Spook That Sat Beside the Door. My.
Yeah, he mentioned two titles for forthcoming albums. Spook Who Sat by the Door was going to be the last one that he put out, which gives you an idea of his master plan. And the other title that he talked about was called Exit Strategy.
Okay.
So he was thinking so many steps ahead, and definitely planned beyond the flesh, as his friend Rallo Stiles told me. He foresaw every eventuality. I'm sure that he would have loved to live a long life, but he also understood that he was, that tomorrow is not promised to anybody, and particularly for somebody who chose to, stay 10 toes down in his community and was aware that there was a certain amount of hate and also a certain amount of, police harassment, and someone who was bold enough to make a record like FDT, someone who was working to unite the streets, which, if you really do your research and, if you accept the premise that the LAPD is, a dangerous gang, perhaps the biggest and most dangerous gang, they probably don't want to see Crips and Bloods come together and essays. They probably, would not welcome that at all. Divide and rule is a real thing.
Yeah.
So, I think that when I talk about strategy, I know I've given you a long answer, but there's a lot to unpack there, and I hope that, I've laid it out clearly as possible.
Yeah, you did great. The one thing after reading the book and sort of even parts of it just skimming, I was wondering, I was like, so who's he writing this for? Did you have a person did you have a composite of someone who was the targeted person or individual type when you wrote the book, or
That's a really good question. The thought that I had was I knew that Nipsey Hussle was an avid reader, and I knew that he was always had bookshelves in his studio, in his office. He was making reading lists and sharing them with friends and family, and So my thought was I would like this book to be worthy of inclusion in one of his reading lists or in a Nipsey Hussle book club. You know,
Right.
someone that is interested in all the different topics that Nipsey's interested in. In some ways,
Right.
I was writing it for Nipsey, if that makes sense. Like,
Okay.
so there's definitely digressions into a lot of different areas that, you know, get into like history, technology, business, and, you know, race relations in America, African culture. And, you know, it's diverse because his mind was diverse. And I wanted to make sure to show all the different aspects. I mentioned this before we started our interview that, you know, my original manuscript was even longer. And this is a pretty long book for a biography, but there was a lot of material that I just wanted to include because part of what impressed me about Nipsey is just all of this stuff that does not come across to a superficial, casual observer, you know, who says, oh, this is a rapper from, you know, from Slauson and Crenshaw. He was in the streets and, you know, he had a beautiful, famous wife. But, you know, there's a lot more to Nipsey's story. And I think it's important to show the breadth. But no, I didn't think of any one reader. I was thinking a lot about just doing justice to the complexity of Nipsey's mind.
Yeah. Have you heard from the family? Have you gotten any feedback from the friends, the family, or even the fans for that matter? But particularly the family.
The family has not communicated with me about the book. I am looking forward to hearing from Sam, and you know, I know that I've made sure that everybody received a copy of the book, and I've also made it clear that I'm, you know, making a donation from the proceeds of the book to the family and to the Nipsey Hussle Neighborhood Nip Foundation.
Okay.
And that's just because I wanted to do that. It's not a business deal. It's not an authorized book. But no, so far I haven't heard anything from people who I interviewed and people that knew him well. I've gotten great feedback. I've had amazing love from people reading the book. It's been humbling, actually, the response. There's so much love for Nipsey Hussle out there. We all know that. People who paid attention to his movement understand how much, you know, as Big Sean put it, or as Nipsey puts it on that Big Sean record, the block love him with a deep reverence. And that has been shown in the response to the book. And, you know, it's been amazing to see people starting book clubs to talk about the book. I've had people post that it's the first book they've ever bought. I've had people post from prison saying they had their girlfriend send it to them because, you know, they had to read it. And also people who had no idea who Nipsey Hussle was, and, you know, college professors. And, you know, I had the opportunity to speak with several grad students and professors at Howard University who are interested in starting a hip hop studies program. And
wow.
This book was, you know, one of the things they want to teach during that program when it gets up and running. So, you know, there's just been a breathtaking amount of love, and it's been very humbling. You know, after working for several years on this book, you know, it's really, really great to see.
You talk, I mean, at length, the murder is dealt with in a way that sort of, it really pulls it together. I mean, you know, in this internet era that we're in, social media era, you know, you don't get the facts, and if you do get them, they're, you know, it's here, then it's there, and then it's
Right.
You know, it's coming from different places, different times,
Yeah.
mixed with conspiracies.
Well, that.
But
too, right.
yeah, you really dig deep into the murder and kind of pull it together. Can you talk? You know, how did you feel handling that and sort of touch on the witness? There's a lot of very like nuanced writing.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. One of the things that I've said in every interview where this comes up is that I didn't want this to be a book about a tragedy. I wanted it to be about a triumph, because I believe that when you look at the sum total of Nip's life and impact, it's a triumphant story. It has a tragic ending, but I didn't want to focus the book around the murder. I made sure the word death was nowhere on the cover of the book, and I just, I started this with that intention, and then, obviously the tragedy happened, so I had to deal with it. But what I've tried to do in the one chapter where it is dealt with in detail is just to, as you say, like, gather all the reliable information. I don't try to solve the murder. I don't think it's ever going to be solved, frankly. I think it will be like Big and Pac and, Malcolm and some others that I mentioned earlier. It's just always going to be one of those cases where there's unanswered questions. And, the shooter is in custody, or the alleged shooter, the accused shooter is in custody. He has yet to stand trial, mostly due to COVID. It's possible he will never stand trial. They might do a plea deal. He was arrested outside a mental health hospital, so he may be planning to do some kind of insanity plea. I don't know. I think you would have to be insane to do what he did, or was accused of doing. But, a lot of the information in that chapter is from the grand jury testimony transcripts. So, that was a primary source that I used. I did talk to other people who were not interviewed by police. There's some very glaring omissions in the number, in the people that they could have talked to and did not. Yeah. And there are a lot of inconsistencies in the star witness's story. Yeah. Which, you can only speculate what her motives might be for the things that she's saying, or what the police and prosecutors' motives might be for kind of looking the other way at these obvious errors in, and so when you cut a plea deal, I learned in working on the book, you are at risk of losing immunity if you lie. So if anything in her testimony is found to be a lie, she can be charged and tried. There are some pretty obvious stretches of, the imagination in just the transcript. And the fact that no one pointed that out, I mean, even the prosecutor in the transcript, you can see him sort of, saying, are you sure you didn't see, you had no idea this guy was in a gang, even though he had giant rolling 60s on his chest, and you were in a, romantic relationship with him. And she was like, no, I didn't know. And, and just the fact of, the inconsistencies about whether he, she at one point said in one of her interviews that it was, going to be a drive-by, but then they pulled in the parking lot, and then later she claims that she was surprised that he tried to, commit this heinous act. So, all that stuff to me is actually not very interesting compared to what I find so inspiring about Nipsey's story. But I did want to put it down in a factual record, if only to document what I hope will not be another travesty of justice in the courts, but it's just important to document. This is what we do. We're journalists, right? So I put the facts down as best I could put them. And, I did speak with one LAPD investigator who didn't want me to use his name. He would have let me use his name if I didn't want to quote him fully on all the things he was telling me. And I thought it was more important to say the information than to say his name. But this is a black officer who has a good working knowledge of, what's known in the investigation, and also what the streets are saying in LA, and without giving away too much of his background, he's a reliable source, I think, as much as you can trust anyone in the police force. And he basically, outlined some of the things that aren't being said in the investigation, and also said, frankly, that the police are never going to see Nipsey Hussle as someone worthy of respect. They're always going to look at him as a gangbanger, full stop, and nothing more of interest really than that. And and that, because I was asking, why is there, at the same time that a street is being named after, it's Ermias Asghedom Square now. Right. It's Lawson and Crenshaw. He's been, honored by the mayor. He was going to meet with the chief of police to talk about relations between the community and the cops. And how is there such a constant, pushback against someone who was obviously doing so much good? How can, a person who's creating businesses and opportunities for employment and doing things that need to be done in that neighborhood that no one else is doing, how can you fight against that? And how can you want to see, him and his brother evicted from their business when, they're providing legitimate jobs for people who might not have another legitimate option? And he just said, they're always going to just be gangbangers to the police. They're always going to say, well, how did they make their first dollar? Way back in the day. And it's like, at some point, you just, I don't know, it's frustrating to hear these kinds of statements, but, I want
Well, that's the pot calling the kettle black. I just have to say it. No pun intended.
For real. Yeah. Exactly. No, I mean, that's the thing, and it's outrageous. There's no justification for the kind of harassment that Sam and Nipsey were experiencing at the Marathon store and in other times in their life too. But I think it's important to get it all documented, and I don't have high hopes that the police or the courts are going to get to the bottom of this case any more than they are, Malcolm X's case, which I heard is being reopened.
Yep.
So that's what I tried to do in that chapter. I didn't want to, go too deep into the conspiracy theories, but I tried to show how these theories arise and what can be, substantiated and what can be, ignored as a distraction, basically.
I came really close to interviewing his mother because we posted something surrounding, or at least questioning, the prevailing narrative. And I guess you could say it fell into conspiracy theories, but to me, it was not out of the realm of possibilities. But ultimately, she opted against it, I suppose. I never made that interview happen, but
what was the story, if you don't mind?
Well, it was just framing his murder in historical context. So if you look at the Fred Hampton movie,
right?
You can make a link to Nipsey fairly easily. It's not
for sure
out of the question. You know what I mean? So it was that type of article.
Right. No, and I have some of the same thoughts. That's why I've been talking about Bunchy Carter and the link to the Slawsons and the Panthers, and I think Nipsey was aware of that history, and I believe he says on the record that came out with the Judas and the Black Messiah, he says, "Young Malcolm, I'm the leader in this thing," and he wore the Malcolm pendant. He talked about being Tupac of my generation, but I think that he was actually aiming higher than even that, and I asked him about the Tupac line, when we spoke around Victory Lap, because obviously you would have to, right? Any journalist has to ask that. So he said, I know that's a big statement, but what he chose to tell me in that interview was that he believed that Tupac was a Trojan horse for the streets, that there was a lot more going on inside him than what that thug life image might suggest.
Right.
And that, you know, his exact words, Nipsey said, in our culture, street culture, being intelligent is sometimes looked at as a form of weakness.
Right.
And Nip said that he could relate to that feeling also. Yeah. So that was the parallel that he pointed out. And then, of course, as the research for the book went on, I learned about the connection where, you know, Afeni Shakur actually invited him to come perform at a Tupac Better Days, you know, a posthumous album launch in Atlanta, which is just crazy. Like, what are the chances that she would zero in on him? This is before he was even called Nipsey Hussle. He was rapping under the name Concept at the time. And she just heard something in that record that she was like, I want this young man to be flown from LA to Atlanta, and I'm going to ride in the van with him from the airport. And while they're riding in the van, you know, Mutulu Shakur calls from behind bars and asks to speak to Ermias. Like, it's a crazy story. So
that's crazy.
Yeah, mind-blowing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I understand the questions that you raised in that article, and I have those same questions. And I know that, like, soon after the murder, the biggest theory that people were talking about a lot was the Dr. Sebi thing. You know, that was, you know, there's so many people pointing to the documentary that Nipsey was working on, and the fact that he believed that, you know, there was more to the death of Dr. Sebi than just, you know, poor conditions in the prison that he was being held in at the time. But, you know, Dr. Sebi's family discount those theories, right? When they give interviews, they tend to say there was no conspiracy that we're aware of. He died because he was in a prison with poor conditions, and he was in poor health, or, you know, he had health issues as a result of his confinement in this prison. Similarly, when the Dr. Sebi theories were running wild, you know, soon after March 31st, there were statements made on behalf of Nipsey's family that we don't want to be hearing all this right now. You know, that this is not a line of inquiry that is particularly comforting to the family at this time. I don't know if that's the same thing as saying it's absolutely untrue and impossible, but maybe just respect our feelings at this time. You know, let's not go on and on about, you know, pharmaceutical companies and assassination plots and things like that. But, you know, Nip's mom referred to his death as an assassination at the BET Awards. And, you know, she chose her words, I'm sure, with care and intention. And so, you know, I think some things are just not going to be worked out in a court of law. You know, there are some things that go beyond the judge and police, and, you know, and I think the fact that Nipsey Hussle's image and legacy have become so powerful just shows you that, you know, his legacy and his mission are ongoing. And, you know, it doesn't take away the pain for the family who lost a father and a husband and a brother and a son. But for the whole wide world, you know, Nipsey Hussle is going to be here for a long time, you know, and his words and his mission, his example are being emulated. And I know that this book has been embraced in part because, you know, people wanted to learn more. They wanted to understand his story more fully. And I thought that was something that I had an obligation to do as a journalist who's been paying attention to hip hop for a long time, and I've worked on books. And I just felt like I was in a position to do this story justice. And I'm very pleased that people have supported the book. And it's great to have this conversation with you. This is definitely one of the better interviews that I've done on this rollout. I appreciate your time and, you know, experience that you're bringing to it.
Thanks a lot, man. New York Times best-selling book, The Marathon Don't Stop: The Life and Times of Nipsey Hussle by Mr. Rob Kenner, man. I got an autographed copy, by the way.
Yes, you
Right,
do.
right there,
It's
right
only
there.
right.
Yeah, man.
And
Thank
Greg,
you.
Greg, I got you. I don't know if you're still on the line, but you know, I got you. I just didn't have your address, so you know.
Greg's in the background there, but
Okay.
no, thank you so much. And we will. By the way, tell people where they can find you and the book.
Oh, okay. Well, best thing is just go to my socials at Robert J. Kenner on Instagram and Twitter. There's also a website, robertjkenner.com, and the link is in the bio to all the, you know, audiobook, ebook. But I definitely encourage people to support your local bookstore. COVID has been really great for Amazon and really hard on the mom and pop bookstores. So
Yeah.
if you can find a local bookstore to support, do that. You know, there was an amazing, one of the best reviews that I got from, you know, this whole rollout of the Marathon Don't Stop was Malik Books, which is one of the biggest black-owned bookstores in LA. He's got 2 locations in LA. He just liked the book and put it up for sale in his store, and then apparently he has this thing where he checks in with Ryan Seacrest on his radio show
Okay.
to like talk about his favorite book from time to time. Like Ryan has Malik on speed dial, so he did his whole spontaneous endorsement of the Marathon Don't Stop, which Ryan Seacrest put on his YouTube and radio. I was just like, this can't be real, but it is real. So yeah, there's a lot of love out there. Thank you to Malik Books, and you know, support your local bookstore.
All right, man. I appreciate your time, and shout out to Nip, man. Rest in peace. Anybody that met him, it's a life worth examining, which is the theme of my you know, I'm reading another book again, DMX's book.
Earl.
Yeah. So it's again, he had a life worth examining, and
no question.
That's why it's a worthy read for sure. It's very, very well put together. So thank you.
Nipsey Hussle, and thank you, Chuck and Greg. You know, all hip hop has meant a lot to lots of artists, including Nipsey Hussle and people who love hip hop culture. And thanks for everything that you've done for this culture on your platform. It's, you know, irreplaceable platform for this.
We're not going anywhere.
That's what's up.
Yeah.
That's what's up.
Salute.
All right. Much respect, man. Appreciate the moment that we could share together today.
No doubt. Peace.